I'm Katerina, Hinkle. The topic for this week in Lent is service, and so that is what we're going to be looking into this morning. We're starting in Mark 10, and sit back, relax, and just listen to this interesting exchange. Starting in verse 35 of Mark 10. When James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him, "Teacher," they said, "we want you to do for us whatever we ask." "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. They replied, "Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory." "You don't know what you are asking," Jesus said. "Can you drink the cup I drink or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with?" "We can," they answered. Jesus said to them, "You will drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with. But to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared." When the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." Listening to this exchange, you might be shocked by James and John's request of Jesus, and you might be enraged right alongside the disciples, and you might celebrate Jesus' answer. And at first look, those reactions are justified. Wow! Considering what James and John asked. This morning, however, I wish to look into this passage a little deeper. I want us to chew on what is going on here and to face how this story is, in fact, our story. And to do this, I want to tackle it from the three participants in this exchange. Or actually, there's three groups of participants. You have James and John, then you have the disciples, and last, Jesus. So James and John, we've just heard what they did. These brothers, they go to Jesus and they actually say, "We want you to do what we ask." Wow, isn't that cringeworthy? And they say, "Let us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory." And Jesus is like, "You don't know what you're asking." And in fact, they probably didn't grasp fully what they were asking. They're asking the Creator and Master, Lord and King and God of all the universe and of the entire spiritual realm to grant them the very highest position beside Jesus in eternity. So yes, I'll give you that. They are way out of line. It takes a lot of pride and ambition and just plain old gall to even come up with a request like that, let alone to go through with it and actually ask Jesus. So if you are shocked and horrified and embarrassed for James and John, that makes a whole lot of sense. I think you're in good company. In their defense, however, let's just take a moment and to see this from their perspective. They are, after all, one of the 12 apostles. And the original 12 disciples, they were chosen. Jesus chose them, and they do stick with Jesus right through to the end. Tradition holds that James is one of the first of the 12 apostles to be martyred, and then John, who's the same John that wrote the book of Revelation, he is exiled onto the island of Patmos. And so he is living a life of hardship, trying to live on his own. He's isolated. He doesn't have any conveniences. So he did also suffer. Both of them did for their trust in Jesus. But here's the clincher, and it's a big but. They felt that their commitment to Jesus merited a certain status, a position right next to Jesus. And so we look down on James and John, and generally in the Bible, we look down on people who have such attitudes and position-seeking thinking. However, is this not exactly how many of us operate without any consideration given to our Christian faith and worldview? Aren't so many of us constantly working and fighting for what we deserve? So think about it. You've worked for a while at a place and they offer training and you complete it right through to the end. Or you've achieved a certain level of education, or you're just proving yourself in some way. Don't we also fight to be rewarded and recognized like James and John? We meet with our boss or whoever's in charge, and we essentially do what they did. We ask for what we want and for what we think we deserve. Now, I agree with you. I readily agree that James and John, what they did is way out of line. But what I challenge us to consider is whether or not we have some of that very same pride and ambition in ourselves. Well, let's put them aside for now and go on to the disciples and their reaction. So their part in all of this starts in verse 41. When the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. Not too surprisingly, the disciples lose their tempers when they find out what James and John have done. But there is hypocrisy in their reaction. So think about it. This account of what James and John did is found in Mark 10. And in Mark 9, not that long before, just one chapter before, this is what happens. They came to Capernaum, and they is Jesus and the disciples. And when he was in the house, Jesus asked them, "What were you discussing on the way?" But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. This topic, who is the greatest, is apparently a point of contention with the disciples. In chapter 9 of Luke and then chapter 18 of Matthew, we find this again. The disciples came to Jesus saying, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And again, near the end of Jesus' life, we again witnessed the disciples obsessing over who is the greatest. Jesus is upstairs with his disciples observing Passover. He breaks the bread. He passes the wine. But this is no ordinary Passover. Jesus reveals with each step that he is the bread. He is the wine. And he will soon die. It is a solemn and holy moment. And right on the heels of this critical teaching moment, the disciples begin to argue. Luke 22:24, a dispute arose among them as to which of them was considered to be greatest. How quickly is Jesus' revelation just pushed aside and the disciples fall back into their self-centered way of thinking? It's clear from these accounts that the disciples, too, wanted recognition and status, not just James and John. Sure, the other 10 may not have asked to sit at Jesus' left and his right, but they didn't exhibit a lot of humility either. They act as a warning and a lesson to us. How quickly do we turn from Jesus' teaching on service and on kingdom greatness and just pursue our own selfish desires and ambitions? Do you know how hard it is to be married to a pastor sometimes? Jason and I argue about this a lot. And part of how I developed out of my dysfunctional childhood, add on my sinful nature, add on that I'm just living in this broken world of ours, and I am very inclined, and I mean very inclined to want position and recognition, reward, and just a good old plain pat on the back So when I'm crying, and I don't mean like crying like, oh, I mean like literally crying with Jason, how life isn't fair and how I work so hard and I'm tired of being overlooked. And the worst people get ahead all the time. And Jason's like, but Katerina, those aren't kingdom values. I don't care. I don't care. Because I live in this world, and this is how the world works, and it's in my face every day. I go to work, it's there. I come home, it's there. I go on social media, it's there. I watch a movie, it's there. I am tired of being the overlooked servant. Now, I would never ask Jesus to sit at his left and his right. I know that much. But come on, can I not have other things? I want a fancy title on my business card, and I want certain letters behind my name. Or I would like a bonus every year. Just surprise me. That would be really nice, and can you do that promptly, please? And when I serve and do the small things, I want a medal. And I know all the right answers, Jason, because for Pete's sakes, I'm a pastor's wife, and I'm familiar with Jesus' teaching, but at the end of the day, I want, period. And you're probably thinking, oh, she's so funny. And this is a great way to make a point in this sermon, but you can believe that. And I would love it if you just believed I'm trying to be funny. But this is a very real struggle in my life and in my faith journey with Jesus. And I call it like a screaming force in my life, and I battle it every day. I know that many of us in our own ways are like James and John, and me, and wanting a place of status in return for our service. And I know that many of us are like the disciples in comparing ourselves to others and wanting to know who is the greatest. So having explored James and John and Katerina, apparently, and other disciples, we now turn our attention to Jesus and see his response to all of this. And we find this back in Mark 10, verse 42. Jesus called them together, and he said, "You know that those who were regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." I find it interesting that Jesus starts this with, you know. Jesus and his disciples, they do know what the Gentile rulers were like. They're throwing their weight around, or they're making sure that people under them know who's boss. And I'm guessing that many of us here have lived and worked under that kind of so-called leadership. And in stark contrast to that kind of leader, Jesus points to himself, the Son of Man, as our example of greatness and service. And it's almost like Jesus expects us to be like him and to follow him. And he didn't even give us a halfway option. It's not like he said, well, here's the Gentile rulers and here's me, but if you just make it this far and serve just a little bit in humility, we can call it good. You can be my disciple. No. He said, in your pursuit of the American dream, be sure to be the servant. Not even that. He's not asking us to work it into our fancy first world life. He says, not so with you. And then he even points to himself as the example. His entire life is an act of worship and service to the Father, and he requires and expects no less from us. Listen to what his example looks like. He gave up his status to become part of creation and serve creation. He put others' needs before his own. He fed people. He healed people. He touched people, including the sick and the dead. And culturally, that's problematic. He welcomed people and included them. He taught people. And this one is especially convicting. He was generous with his time, his energy, his emotions. He spent time with sinners and outcasts and the disenfranchised, like children and women. He cared for people he knew would betray him and crucify him. He was patient, kind, and forgiving. He gave his life for others. So that is what kingdom-centered service and greatness looks like. So not only is Jesus an example of service, he's actually the example of what servant living looks like. It would be one thing if he did all those things, then he went home to his mansion with all his servants and luxuries and was waited on hand and foot. But no, his example of kingdom greatness does not even involve worldly rewards. He gave up his title and status as the King of Kings. He did not have a home. He did not have fancy clothes or fancy things. Honestly, I don't even know if he had things. He did not have income. He lived on the generosity of others. He did not have financial savings or earthly security. He didn't have friends in high places, and the friends he did have were fickle. And this, he did not gloat about his greatness or lord it over others. Rather, his greatness flowed from his submission to the Father and his obedience to what God wanted him to do. So in conclusion, Jesus is clear in what he's calling his disciples, and that means us. He's clear in what he's calling us to do. The danger is that we ignore Jesus' teaching and just continue on our path, pursuing a worldly version of greatness rather than choosing the kind of service that Jesus lived out. Not so with you. Jesus calls us to a completely different way of living and serving, one that his own disciples clearly were struggling to grasp. Unlike James and John and their outrageous request, we are called to serve without expecting anything in return. Unlike the disciples, we are to serve anonymously and under the radar, without the title of greatest. No, our example of greatness is Jesus himself. And his words challenge us to examine ourselves. It is way too easy to give the Christ-centered life a polite nod and then just keep going on in pursuit of the American dream. Most of us, when we look at Jesus' example or John the Baptist or any of the apostles, we make sure that their example cannot or will not apply to us. Oh, that was back then. I live in the modern age now. I can't expect myself or my family to be radical like that. That's just not practical. It's not my fault I live in a first world country. Those people were special back then. I'm just not called that way. And little by little, we reason our way out of obeying Jesus. We become numb to the very clear teaching he has for us. Wake up! Examine yourself, your thinking, and your priorities. And don't let yourself off the hook. Don't let yourself be distracted by the lure of worldly greatness. and recognition that just leaves you empty in the end. If I could grab each of you by the collar and shake you, I would say, wake up! And I would expect you as my church family to do the same for me. Thankfully, I have a good husband and a good sister who remind me constantly of Jesus' teaching and what real greatness looks like. At certain points in my adult life, I found myself at a crossroads. Do you get it? Crossroads. Crossroads. So I've had to make hard decisions. And they're hard because I really struggle with this. Am I going to pursue success, the next rung on the ladder, greater income, greater this and that? Or am I going to pursue a different path, one that gives me the space and even the energy to serve God and others, and just the opportunity to do that? I'd like to say that these decisions are easy for me, but they're not. And because I'm prone to seek status, I must continually examine myself, search the scriptures, journal, pray, and remind myself of what is eternally important. Wake up. Examine yourself. Serve quietly. Serve anonymously. Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Will you bow with me and we can pray for each other? Jesus, you are so kind and gentle with the disciples and their ridiculousness and their ambition and pride that they don't even see. And we're trusting that you are kind and gentle and patient with us in our own blindness. We have hidden desires and ambitions and pride, comparing ourselves to each other, and here you are, the great, the only, our mighty King, come to sacrifice yourself for us. We can't even hope to follow you in your example without your Spirit in us. Jesus, we invite you to transform us, cleanse us from our sins of self-centeredness. And we give you praise that you are true and faithful, that you walk with us, just as you walked with the very broken, misguided disciples. We entrust ourselves anew to you this morning. In Jesus' name, amen.